Ask anyone where the center of the global financial world is, and they will inevitably point to a narrow, shadowed street in lower Manhattan, Wall Street. It is much more than just a geographic location on a map. It is a universal synonym for colossal wealth, untouchable corporate power, and the invisible strings that manipulate the destiny of entire nations. Today, we take this overwhelming power entirely for granted, as if New York City was always naturally destined by geography and divine right to be the world's bank. Traditional history textbooks present us with a very comfortable, sanitized story of brilliant inventors, bold entrepreneurs, and the natural, inevitable triumph of American free market capitalism. They tell you that Wall Street's absolute global power is simply the result of American ingenuity and the logical outcome of a thriving democratic superpower. But they are entirely wrong. This comfortable, heroic narrative is at best a naive simplification, and at worst a deliberately constructed myth designed to hide a much darker reality. The true origin of Wall Street's dominance is far more cynical, utterly chaotic, and deeply dependent on historical events that initially had absolutely nothing to do with finance. The overwhelming power of New York was not built on technological innovation, but on crushing national debt, the mechanics of total war, ruthless monopoly, and the systemic, catastrophic failures of other sovereign nations. It was not created by the mythical free markets, but by massive, unprecedented government intervention and the darkest, most desperate hours of global history. To understand how this happened, we have to look past the modern glass skyscrapers and dig down into the mud of the 17th century. The street literally gets its name from a 12-foot wooden wall built by Dutch settlers in 1653 to protect their small trading post of New Amsterdam from Native American attacks and the British military. For over a century, it was nothing more than a muddy path running alongside a rotting wooden palisade, home to a slave market and a few scattered merchants. Even after the American Revolution, New York was not the center of the new nation. Philadelphia was larger, richer, and politically more significant. Today, we will strip away the mythology and expose the raw, unforgiving historical machinery that transformed this muddy defensive perimeter into the financial dictator of the planet. This is the true story of how New York systematically stole the financial crown from London, and it is a story built on the brink of national collapse. We must begin our journey not with wealthy bankers in silk top hats, but with starving soldiers, the smell of gunpowder, and a desperately bankrupt new government. The year is 1790, and the United States of America has just miraculously won its political independence from the British Empire. But it has completely lost its economy in the process. The new fragile nation is literally drowning in an ocean of unpayable debt. The Continental Congress and the 13 individual states had borrowed tens of millions of dollars from France, from Holland, and from their own patriotic citizens to fund the Revolutionary War. There was absolutely no national currency, no central banking system, and no established federal mechanism to collect reliable taxes. American national credit was completely worthless on the global stage. The new nation's government bonds were being desperately traded in the streets for mere pennies on the dollar, considered by most European investors to be nothing more than useless scraps of paper. If the new, fragile republic could not find a way to pay its massive debts, it would inevitably collapse into anarchy before it truly began, leaving it perfectly ripe for reconquest by opportunistic European empires. Into the center of this existential crisis stepped a man who understood the mechanics of raw power better than any of his revolutionary contemporaries, Alexander Hamilton. As the very first Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton possessed a grand, controversial vision for the future of America, and that vision was built entirely on a foundation of highly centralized financial power. His most radical and dangerous proposal was known as the Assumption Bill. He proposed that the new federal government should completely take on, or assume, all of the massive individual war debts of the 13 separate states. To pay for this colossal undertaking, he would issue brand new federal government bonds, guaranteed and backed by the full faith and credit of the newly unified United States. Hamilton did not see national debt as a terrible burden that needed to be cleared and paid off as quickly as humanly possible. He saw national debt as the ultimate political tool of control. He knew mathematically that if the wealthiest, most influential elite of America held their wealth in federal government bonds, they would suddenly have a direct, vested, and selfish interest in the absolute survival of that new government. He explicitly wanted to tie the personal fortunes of the rich directly to the political success of the new republic, ensuring they would use their power to keep the government from failing. Hamilton's financial plan was desperately controversial and bitterly hated by the agrarian politicians of the South, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. States like Virginia, which had responsibly already paid off most of their wartime debts, furiously opposed the idea of being taxed to bail out financially negligent northern states like Massachusetts. The young nation was on the absolute brink of tearing itself apart over the issue of money before the Constitution was even fully tested. But in the sweltering summer of 1790, behind closed doors at a private dinner table, a historic, fateful deal was finally struck. In exchange for Southern political support to pass his massive debt assumption plan, Hamilton agreed to move the permanent national capital away from the commercial centers of the North. They agreed to place the new capital on a humid, swampy patch of land on the Potomac River, carefully sandwiched between the southern states of Maryland and Virginia, a place that would become Washington, D.C. This specific moment is where countless historians make a crucial, fundamental mistake in their analysis of American power. They focus all their attention on the political compromise that created Washington, D.C., but they entirely ignore the massive, unintended economic consequences this decision had for New York City. By deliberately moving the political capital far away from New York, the economic heart and the political brain of the new nation were permanently separated. Washington, D.C. was destined to become the city of endless debate, slow bureaucracy, and political gridlock. New York City, freed from the burden of housing the federal government, was allowed to remain the undisputed city of rapid commerce, aggressive capital, and unbridled ambition. But Hamilton still desperately needed a centralized, physical location for his millions of dollars in newly issued government bonds to be actively traded. He needed to create a highly liquid financial market from scratch. In May of 1792, just 2 years after Hamilton's debt plan was passed, 24 prominent stockbrokers and merchants gathered in the shade of a buttonwood tree on Wall Street. They drafted and signed the Buttonwood Agreement, a document establishing strict rules, standardized commission structures, and a closed system for trading government bonds and stock in the newly formed First Bank of the United States. In that singular moment under a tree, the New York Stock Exchange was officially born. It is vital to understand that Hamilton did not create a free market in the modern, idealized sense of the word. He deliberately created a highly centralized debt exchange, explicitly designed to tie massive private wealth to federal government power. As this nascent financial market did not trade in technological innovation, manufacturing, or private enterprise. For its first several decades, Wall Street traded almost exclusively in the price of state survival and government debt. But trading government debt could only sustain a financial market to a certain limited extent. To truly grow into a global powerhouse, New York City needed a massive physical connection to the rest of the vast, completely untapped, and resource-rich American continent. In the early decades of the 19th century, the functional economy of the United States essentially ended at the imposing barrier of the Appalachian Mountains. Transporting harvested grain, timber, or manufactured goods from the western frontier to the East Coast was incredibly slow, prohibitively expensive, and highly dangerous. While rival port cities like Philadelphia and Baltimore were desperately trying to build expensive turnpike roads and early rail lines over the steep mountains, New York looked at its unique geography and saw a completely different revolutionary path: water. In 1817, New York Governor DeWitt Clinton proposed an infrastructure project so massive, so technologically unprecedented, and so wildly ambitious that it was openly ridiculed by the press as Clinton's big dit. His staggering plan was to dig a continuous 363-mile artificial canal, carving through solid rock and dense forests, connecting the Hudson River at Albany directly to Lake Erie at Buffalo. This would magically create a continuous, navigable water route from the Atlantic Ocean straight into the Great Lakes, effectively unlocking the entire agricultural wealth of the American Midwest. The estimated price tag for this engineering marvel was absolutely astronomical, and Thomas Jefferson's federal government flatly refused to provide a single penny of national funding for it. Faced with federal rejection, New York did something that its rival cities of Baltimore or Philadelphia simply could not do. It turned directly to its young, aggressive financial market operating on Wall Street. New York State decided to finance the massive construction of the Erie Canal, not through direct, unpopular taxation of its citizens, but by selling millions of dollars in state-issued infrastructure bonds. Wall Street brokers aggressively marketed these state bonds to wealthy investors, promising reliable, steady returns backed by the guaranteed future toll revenues of the completed canal. But crucially, these New York brokers did not just sell these bonds to wealthy Americans. Wall Street sent its agents across the Atlantic and successfully tapped into the massive, centuries-old pools of aristocratic capital sitting in London, Amsterdam, and Liverpool. European investors, desperately looking for higher, more exciting returns than they could ever get in their own stagnant domestic markets, flooded New York with millions in foreign cash. When the Erie Canal finally opened in 1825, it fundamentally changed the entire American economy practically overnight. The cost of shipping freight from the Midwest to the Atlantic coast dropped by an unbelievable 90% in a matter of months. The grueling, dangerous journey from Buffalo to New York City was instantly cut from 3 agonizing weeks to just 6 smooth days. Manhattan Island was now the essential, unavoidable geographic bottleneck for all the grain, lumber, and raw materials flowing out of the American heartland. Simultaneously, it became the exclusive entry point for all the manufactured luxury goods flowing from European factories back into the expanding American West. New York, which had once been a second-tier colonial port, suddenly bypassed all its rivals and became the undisputed principal mercantile megacity of the Americas. But the millions of dollars in canal bonds did something even more important for Wall Street than physically building the canal. The bonds proved to the entire world that Wall Street possessed the unique, sophisticated machinery required to mobilize the immense, staggering amounts of capital needed for continental-scale engineering projects. It taught the global financial system that New York was the primary, most efficient, and most reliable entry point for foreign capital looking to profit off the United States. The Erie Canal bonds were merely the opening act, the dress rehearsal for the main economic event that was about to arrive on the American landscape. So iron, steam, and the birth of the massive private corporation. The Erie Canal had been a state-led, government-sponsored infrastructure project that created a booming mercantile city. The very next wave of American development would be entirely private, fiercely corporate, and it would create a financial monster unlike anything the world had ever seen. The railroads. If the canals were the slow, steady veins of the new American economy, the railroads were the rapid steel artery. The trains could go across plains and deserts where water could not. They operated efficiently year-round regardless of winter ice, and they moved heavy freight at terrifying, unprecedented speed. But building a localized canal required state-level capital. Building a sprawling transcontinental railroad network required money on a scale that no single government on Earth could easily command. This is exactly where the legal structure of the modern corporation, combined with the chaotic trading floor of Wall Street, became not just highly useful, but absolutely necessary for human progress. Railroads were the first true iteration of American big business, operating on a scale that dwarfed everything that came before them. They were massive private corporations that required hundreds of millions of dollars in upfront capital to buy steel, land, and labor long before they could earn a single dollar in ticket revenue. To survive, they desperately needed to sell millions of shares of stock to thousands of small speculative investors. But far more importantly, they needed to sell bonds, massive continuous issuances of corporate debt to keep the track-laying machines moving westward. Wall Street eagerly transformed itself into the humming engine room for this massive, unprecedented mobilization of private capital. The New York Stock Exchange, which had once been dominated solely by the polite trading of slow government debt, now became a frantic, roaring casino dominated entirely by volatile railroad security. To synchronize this massive flow of money, Wall Street aggressively adopted a new technology that would forever change the speed of money: the telegraph. The invention of the stock ticker in 1867 meant that for the first time in human history, the exact price of a railroad stock in New York could be known in Chicago or Boston almost instantly. This technological marvel did not democratize finance. It centralized it, ensuring that all regional financial information flowed directly into the beating heart of Lower Manhattan. By the 1850s and 1860s, the big four railroads, the Erie, the Pennsylvania, the New York Central, and the Baltimore and Ohio, had become the absolute largest, most complex organizations in the world outside of national governments. The Pennsylvania Railroad alone employed more people and commanded a larger annual budget than the entire United States federal military. And their entire sprawling, continent-spanning operations were completely, desperately dependent on the banks, brokerages, and investment houses located exclusively on Wall Street. This insatiable, endless need for corporate capital concentrated unimaginable power in an entirely new class of people who had never existed before. These men were not merchants trading physical goods, they were not politicians writing laws, and they were certainly not inventors building machines. They were the investment bankers. Their unique, highly lucrative skill was not in manufacturing anything tangible, but in deeply understanding exactly who had money, who desperately needed money, and how to complexly structure a legal deal to connect them. And of course, their real talent lay in legally extracting a massive, fat commission for themselves in the middle of every single transaction. This is the true defining moment of Wall Street's absolute domestic ascendancy, and it coincided perfectly with the bloodiest, most destructive conflict in American history. The American Civil War did not pause the growth of Wall Street. It radically accelerated its centralization into a monstrous, unstoppable engine of national finance. Just as Alexander Hamilton had discovered in 1790, the federal government suddenly needed money to wage war on a scale never before seen in human history. When the Southern states seceded in 1861, Union Secretary of the Treasury Salmon P. Chase initially turned to the traditional, cautious commercial banks of the East Coast for loans. Yeah, but these conservative banks simply could not provide enough physical gold and silver to fund a modern, mechanized, industrial war that was costing the Union over $1 million a day. The Union desperately needed far more money, and it needed it immediately, or the war would be lost to bankruptcy before it was lost on the battlefield. In a radical move, the federal government abandoned the gold standard entirely and began issuing massive amounts of unbacked fiat currency, famously known as greenback. Simultaneously, the Treasury began issuing billions of dollars in new national war bonds to fund the raising of massive Union armies. But the critical question remained: who possessed the network, the ruthlessness, and the skill to sell these massive amounts of complex bonds to a skeptical, terrified American public? Wall Street. The Treasury turned specifically to a brilliant, aggressive Philadelphia and New York financier named Jay Cooke, who single-handedly revolutionized the entire concept of bond sale. Cooke did not just rely on selling bonds to a few rich European aristocrats. He used aggressive, modern marketing, patriotic propaganda, and a vast network of thousands of traveling agents. He sold 520s war bonds directly to ordinary working-class American citizens, farmers, teachers, and factory workers, convincing them it was their patriotic duty to finance the Union Army. In doing so, Wall Street learned a terrifyingly profitable new lesson. It could mobilize not just the concentrated capital of the European rich, but it could successfully harvest the collective life savings of the American masses. These massive Civil War bond drives created a deeply centralized, incredibly liquid national financial market that was inextricably tethered to one single geographic place: New York City. At the exact same time, the massive logistical demands of the war were creating unimaginable private fortunes for a new breed of ruthless industrialists who were supplying the Union war machine. And when the cannons finally fell silent in 1865, these newly minted robber barons, ruthless, brilliant men like Cornelius Vanderbilt, Andrew Carnegie, and John D. Rockefeller did not take their millions back to Washington or Philadelphia. They all came directly to New York. They desperately needed massive, continuous injections of capital to build their sprawling industrial trusts, their massive steel mills, and their continent-spanning oil refineries. They needed the unique machinery of Wall Street to consolidate their monopolies. And Wall Street, massively enriched by the fat commissions from selling the government's war bonds, was more than ready for them. The Great Railroad expansion had been the initial training ground, But now New York was prepared to exclusively finance the entirety of the Second Industrial Revolution. However, this staggering concentration of financial power harbored a deep, fatal, and systemic flaw that threatened to destroy the entire country. And for the vast majority of the 19th century, the entire American financial system was essentially a towering, unstable house of cards waiting for a strong wind. Unlike the financial systems of Britain, France, or Germany, the United States completely lacked a central bank. Hamilton's original first bank of the United States had been politically assassinated by his rivals, and Andrew Jackson had proudly destroyed the second bank of the United States decades later. This stubborn, ideological hatred of centralized banking left a massive, dangerous vacuum at the very heart of the American macroeconomy. There was absolutely no federal institution to control the money supply, no lender of last resort to step in during a crisis, and zero systemic regulation of the banking industry. The entire national economy was held together only by a loose, fragile network of large private commercial banks, the vast majority of them located in New York, through a highly dangerous system known as pyramiding reserve. Local country banks from all over rural America would take the deposits of their local farmers and deposit their excess cash into the larger, more sophisticated New York banks to earn interest. The New York banks would then recklessly lend that exact same rural money out, primarily as high-interest call loans to aggressive speculators gambling on the Wall Street stock market. This heavily leveraged system worked brilliantly and generated massive profits during the good times. The stock market continuously boomed, artificially fueled by an endless river of call loans drawn from rural banking reserves that were supposedly meant to be safe and secure. But the moment panic inevitably struck, the entire interconnected system would collapse with terrifying speed. A localized crop failure in Kansas or a single railroad bankruptcy in Ohio could instantly cause New York banks to panic and immediately call in their massive stock market loans. This sudden withdrawal of liquidity would instantly cause a brutal stock market crash on Wall Street. Simultaneously, it made it mathematically impossible for the panicked country banks to get their deposited cash reserves back from New York when local farmers came to withdraw their savings. The entire American economy of the late 19th century was defined by this brutal, unregulated boom and bust cycle. The devastating panics of 1837, 1857, 1873, and 1893 were catastrophic, nation-shaking events that routinely wiped out the life savings of millions of ordinary citizens. Historians often focus their academic lenses on the specific, isolated trigger of each individual panic, a failed railroad bond, a crisis over silver coinage, or an isolated speculative bubble bursting. But in focusing on the triggers, they completely miss the true long-term structural consequence of these recurring crises. Each major financial crisis, while utterly devastating to the working-class public, actually served to concentrate even more permanent power in the hands of the absolute largest New York banks. And during every panic, the smaller, weaker, and over-leveraged regional banks were allowed to die and go bankrupt. The strongest, most heavily capitalized Wall Street banks would then swoop in and buy up the valuable assets of their dead competitors for mere pennies on the dollar. Each successive panic aggressively centralized more economic control, making the financial power structure in Manhattan grow taller, narrower, and infinitely more dangerous. This complete lack of federal control ultimately led to a final, terrifying crisis that changed the architecture of the world, and it required a single private citizen to step in where the United States government had utterly failed. The year is 1907. A reckless, highly leveraged scheme by a few rogue speculators to corner the stock of a major copper company spectacularly failed, triggering a massive psychological run on New York's trust companies. These trust companies acted exactly like banks, but operated completely outside the already weak banking regulations of the time, keeping dangerously low cash reserves. The financial panic spread like a wildfire roaring through a dry, dead forest. The massive Knickerbocker Trust Company collapsed, and terrifying lines of desperate depositors stretched for blocks through the streets of Manhattan. The Trust Company of America, an even larger institution, was directly in the crosshairs and was about to fail within hours. If it fell, it would inevitably pull down every single major commercial bank in Manhattan with it. The New York Stock Exchange completely froze as interest rates on short-term loans spiked to an impossible 100%. The entire American economy was teetering on the very brink of a complete, irrevocable, and catastrophic shutdown. And the United States Treasury Department was absolutely helpless to stop it, possessing almost no liquid cash reserves of its own to inject into the dying system. Into this terrifying void of federal power stepped one man, J. Pierpont Morgan. Morgan was the absolute intimidating embodiment of Wall Street, the wealthy son of an international investment banker, the ruthless mastermind who had consolidated the chaotic steel and railroad industries into massive monopolistic trusts. He personally commanded more direct financial credit and global respect than the entire United States federal government. Morgan instantly realized that if the New York banking system failed, his carefully constructed, continent-spanning industrial empire would completely fail along with it. He did not wait for the slow, incompetent politicians in Washington to act. He summoned the presidents of the largest, wealthiest New York banks to his opulent private library on 36th Street, physically locked the heavy brass doors, and gave them a brutal ultimatum. He coldly forced these rival bankers to chip in their own remaining precious cash reserves to create a massive private emergency pool of money to save the Trust Company of America and stop the contagion. Now, for several agonizing weeks, J.P. Morgan sat at a desk in his library and single-handedly managed the entire macro economy of the United States, acting as a one-man central bank. He unilaterally decided which financial institutions were worthy of being saved and which were weak enough to be thrown to the wolves and allowed to fail. When the mayor of New York City approached Morgan, terrified that the city would default on its payroll the next day, Morgan casually wrote a personal check to buy up millions in city bonds that no one else in the world would touch. Morgan's ruthless, brilliant intervention undoubtedly saved the American financial system from total annihilation. But the sheer scale of his power completely terrified the nation. Ordinary Americans suddenly realized with cold clarity that their entire economy was no longer managed by their democratically elected government. It was being actively managed by a tiny handful of unelected, unaccountable private investment bankers in New York, and ultimately by the sheer willpower of one single old man. This widespread public terror finally created the political will necessary for the one thing J.P. Morgan and Wall Street secretly wanted but publicly pretended to hate: a central bank. Traditional history textbooks proudly tell us that the Federal Reserve System was created by progressive reformers to protect the American public from the greed and financial instability of Wall Street. That is the comforting, sanitized public myth taught in school. The private, documented historical reality is that the architecture of the Federal Reserve was secretly designed by Wall Street itself to legitimize, protect, and permanentize Wall Street's absolute power. In November of 1910, a highly secretive meeting was held under the cover of a duck hunting trip at an exclusive private club on Jekyll Island, off the remote coast of Georgia. The attendees were a secret cabal of the most powerful New York bankers, including Paul Warburg and representatives of the Morgan and Rockefeller empires, along with exactly one U.S. Senator, Nelson Aldrich. Senator Aldrich was deeply embedded in the financial elite. His own daughter was married to J.P. Morgan's son. These men spent 10 days in absolute, total secrecy, drafting the complex financial architecture for what would eventually become the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. They were politically astute enough to know that the populist American public would never, ever accept a single, monolithic central bank openly controlled by New York financiers. So they cleverly designed a brilliantly disguised, supposedly decentralized system to fool the politicians and the public. There would be 12 regional Federal Reserve banks spread across the country in cities like Dallas, St. Louis, and San Francisco. This geographic spread provided the perfect optical illusion of democratic decentralization and regional control. But the plan's true. Hidden genius lay in understanding exactly where the actual mathematical power of the new system would be inevitably concentrated: the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Hey, because New York City was already the nation's overwhelmingly dominant money market, holding the vast majority of the nation's banking reserves, its regional Fed bank automatically became the massive, undeniable engine of the entire system. The New York Fed would physically manage the nation's massive gold reserves in its underground vaults. The New York Fed would exclusively carry out the critical open market operations, the buying and selling of government bonds, that actually controlled the nation's money supply and interest rates. And the New York Fed would serve as the ultimate limitless lender of last resort for the massive Wall Street institution. The creation of the Federal Reserve did not break up the infamous money trust in New York. It actually gave that exact same trust a permanent legal government charter and unlimited access to public liquidity. Wall Street now finally had exactly what Alexander Hamilton had originally envisioned in 1790. A centralized financial system backed by the full, unlimited power of the United States government, but managed in daily practice by New York bankers. And then just months after the Federal Reserve was officially created, the absolute unthinkable happened on the global stage. Europe committed collective industrialized suicide. August 1914, the outbreak of World War I. Before the first shots were fired in Europe, the city of London was the absolute, undisputed, and seemingly eternal financial capital of the planet. For centuries, the British pound sterling was the universally trusted world's reserve currency, and the Bank of England acted as the de facto central bank for the entire global economy. London banks financed nearly all global shipping and trade, and the vast majority of global investment capital flowed directly through the mahogany boardrooms of the City of London. And when the Great War began, the British Empire was the world's absolute largest creditor nation, collecting massive interest payments from every corner of the globe. By the time the guns finally fell silent 4 years later, Britain had been transformed into the world's largest debtor. The First World War was not just a human tragedy, it was a rapidly accelerating financial black hole. Europe was literally incinerating its centuries of carefully accumulated, aristocratic wealth in the mud, blood, and artillery barrages of the Western Front. The massive combatant nations, Britain, France, and Germany, needed money on a scale that was mathematically impossible for them to raise through domestic taxation. They absolutely had to borrow massive sums of capital to keep their war machines running. And as the war dragged on, there was only one place left on Earth with enough untouched capital to lend to them: the United States of America. And at the very start of the war in 1914, the U.S. was still technically a debtor nation, heavily dependent on British and European capital for its own domestic development. But virtually overnight, the staggering cost of the European war transformed the United States into the world's ultimate creditor. Wall Street instantly became the highly profitable bridge for this unprecedented, historic flow of global wealth. Investment banks, led primarily by the House of J.P. Morgan, aggressively marketed massive issuances of British and French war bonds directly to American investors. They successfully mobilized hundreds of millions of dollars in domestic American capital to lend to the desperate Allied powers. But Wall Street did much more than just lend money and collect interest. It became the exclusive, centralized purchasing agent for the entire Allied war effort. Britain and France were forced to buy billions of dollars worth of American-made supplies, canned food, cotton, copper, and high-explosive artillery shells to survive. Every single dollar spent on an American artillery shell or a bag of American grain was financed by a Wall Street loan, and represented a dollar of pure capital being permanently drained from London to New York. New York, the commercial banks aggressively replaced British banks in financing routine global trade, especially in Latin America and Asia, as British capital was diverted entirely to the trenches. Slowly but surely, the American dollar began to directly replace the British pound sterling as the world's most trusted, stable currency for international settlements. J.P. Morgan and Company single-handedly processed over $3 billion in Allied purchasing orders during the war, legally earning a staggering guaranteed commission on every single transaction. The brutal mechanics of World War I made the American industrial economy incredibly rich, but it made Wall Street permanently, globally dominant. By the end of 1918, the United States physically held more than half of the entire world's sovereign gold reserves, safely locked away in the vaults of the New York Federal Reserve. Every single major European nation, both the victors and the vanquished, was now deeply, impossibly in debt to the bankers of Lower Manhattan. The prestigious crown of global finance had not just accidentally slipped from London's head, it had been forcibly, economically amputated by the machinery of total war. New York City was now the undisputed, unchallengeable financial center of the planet. And even when Wall Street's own reckless, unregulated speculation led to the catastrophic stock market crash of 1929 and the subsequent Great Depression, its ultimate power was not destroyed. The financial reforms of the 1930s New Deal, the creation of the SEC, the separation of commercial and investment banking did not dismantle Wall Street. These government interventions actually saved Wall Street from its own destructive greed, integrating the massive New York financial institutions even more deeply into the protective architecture of the federal government. Historians and economists often present this century-long triumph as the natural, meritocratic, and inevitable result of superior American economic ingenuity. This is the deeply comforting, patriotic myth that we tell ourselves to rationalize the immense power concentrated in a few square miles of Manhattan. The uncomfortable, historically accurate truth is that the absolute power of Wall Street was not an inevitable triumph of the free market, but a highly parasitic accident of history. It was not built primarily on technological innovation, but on the aggressive monetization of sovereign debt. It was not created by the invisible hand of the free market, but by massive, desperate government intervention in the crises of 1790, 1861, 1907, and 1913. New York did not win a fair, peaceful economic race against London. It merely survived and profited immensely while London systematically destroyed its own empire in the trenches of France. The true, unvarnished origins of Wall Street's global power were a bankrupt, revolutionary state, a muddy canal ditch in upstate New York, the engineering of continent-spanning corporate monopolies, and the systemic, self-destructive failures of European empire. That narrow, shadowed street in Lower Manhattan became the center of the world not by always being the best, but by being the last heavily fortified place standing when the world's other financial structures were collapsing. Understanding this true history is absolutely crucial because it forces us to finally see Wall Street's immense power not as an unchangeable law of nature, but as a constructed historical phenomenon. And a phenomenon that is so deeply dependent on systemic failure, massive debt, and state intervention is not a naturally stable structure. The modern global financial system that dictates our lives today is built directly on top of these chaotic historical accidents. And until we stop mistaking these historical accidents for pure merit, we will never truly understand the true fragile nature of the financial power that currently rules our world. The true origin of Wall Street's power is a dark, complex story of debt, war, and engineered structural vulnerability. It is a story that mainstream history desperately tries to forget, but it is one that our modern global economy is condemned to continuously